The world is still, perfectly still, in that profound quiet that exists only in the hours before dawn. The deep darkness of night is just beginning to soften, imperceptibly at first, into something gentler. Not light yet, but the promise of light, the faintest suggestion that somewhere beyond the horizon, the sun is stirring. And in homes and temples across the ancient world, people are beginning to wake, not to the harsh sound of alarms, but to something older, more natural, an inner knowing that the new day is approaching. We can imagine ourselves in any number of these places, in any time, watching this sacred transition from darkness into light. Perhaps we're in a modest home in ancient Athens, or a temple complex in Egypt, or a simple dwelling in the mountains of Peru. The principle is the same everywhere. This gentle awakening to greet the sun, to acknowledge the gift of a new day, to offer prayers and preparations before the light fully arrives. There's something deeply peaceful about these pre-dawn hours, something that humans have always recognized and honored. The darkness is not frightening anymore. It's familiar, comfortable, like a soft blanket being slowly pulled back. The world feels hushed, expectant, as though nature itself is holding its breath, waiting for that first glimpse of light. In ancient Egypt, the priests would be among the first to wake. Long before the sun touched the horizon, they would rise from their sleeping mats, feet touching cool stone floors, and begin their preparations. The temples were oriented with such precision to catch the first rays of sunlight. Astronomical observations refined over centuries, creating structures that were themselves prayers in stone, aligned with the heavens, honoring the eternal cycle of darkness and light. The high priest, or perhaps one of his assistants, would make their way through the dark temple corridors. They knew these paths intimately. Every step, every turn, navigated as much by memory and touch as by the faint light of the small oil lamp they carried. The lamp created a tiny circle of golden light, just enough to see by, casting long shadows that moved and danced along the ancient walls. We can picture the ritual washing that would come first. Water drawn from sacred pools or special vessels, cool and clean, used to purify the body before approaching the gods. The priests would wash their hands, their face, their feet, each action deliberate, mindful, part of the preparation. The water would be cold in the pre-dawn darkness, a sharp sensation that helped clear away the last remnants of sleep, making them fully present, fully awake to their purpose. The incense would be prepared next. Carefully measured portions of frankincense and myrrh, precious resins that had traveled great distances to reach these temples. The priests would crush them gently with a mortar and pestle, the sound soft and rhythmic in the quiet, releasing their fragrant oils. When placed on hot coals, the incense would begin to smoke, sending up wisps that curled and twisted in the still air, filling the temple with scent and offering to the gods, a signal that the dawn prayers were beginning. In the inner sanctum, where the statue of the god resided, the most sacred rituals would unfold. The priest would approach the shrine in darkness, speaking quiet words of greeting, gentle acknowledgments of the divine presence. The statue would be cleaned, anointed with sacred oils, dressed in fresh linen garments, treated not as an inanimate object, but as a living deity, present in this place, worthy of care and devotion. The timing of these rituals was crucial. Everything needed to be completed before the sun actually rose, before the first rays of light touched the temple. The act of greeting the sun was meant to be done in readiness, in a state of purity and preparation, not rushed or haphazard, but measured and intentional. The priests had developed an intimate understanding of time, watching the slow progression of stars across the night sky, knowing exactly when to begin, when to move from one part of the ritual to the next. Far from Egypt, in ancient Greece, a different but equally reverent awakening was taking place. In homes scattered across the hillsides, people would rise with the faintest lightening of the eastern sky. The Greeks did not have the elaborate priesthoods of Egypt, but their piety was no less genuine. Morning prayers were offered at small household altars, simple affairs often located in the courtyard, where a family could gather to acknowledge the gods before the day's work began. A woman, perhaps, would be the first to wake in her household. She would rise from her sleeping couch, wrapping herself in a simple cloak against the cool morning air, and make her way quietly through the darkened rooms. Her feet would know every stone of the floor, every slight unevenness, moving with the confidence of countless previous mornings. In the courtyard, she would pause, looking up at the sky, at the stars still visible but beginning to fade, their light growing pale as the darkness gradually transformed. At the household altar, a small structure with offerings from the previous day, she would add something fresh, perhaps a small cake of barley or a handful of grain, or a libation of wine or oil, poured slowly onto the altar stone. The prayers she would speak would be simple, heartfelt, asking for the God's blessing on the household, for health and prosperity, for protection through the coming day. These were not elaborate theological statements, but rather the authentic words of someone genuinely grateful for another morning, another chance to live and work and care for those she loved. The children would still be sleeping, curled up in their beds, but they would wake to a house already blessed, already prepared for the day. This was part of her mother's gift to them, this quiet work done in the darkness, this careful tending of the family's relationship with the divine. They would learn these rituals by watching, by gradually taking on small parts of the morning routine as they grew, until one day they would perform these same acts for their own families. In ancient Rome, similar rituals played out in homes across the city. The Romans were deeply, perhaps almost obsessively religious in their observances. The Lares and Penates, household gods, required daily attention. A small shrine, the Lorarium, would be present in every home, from the grandest villa to the most modest apartment. Before the day's activities could properly begin, offerings needed to be made, prayers spoken. The paterfamilias, the male head of the household, often performed these morning devotions himself. He would approach the Lorarium in the pre-dawn darkness, perhaps lighting a small lamp to illuminate the figurines of the household gods. The offering might be simple, a few drops of wine, some incense, a small portion of food. What mattered was not the material value, but the consistency, the faithful performance of these duties day after day, year after year, maintaining the vital connection between the family and the divine forces that protected them. The Romans understood something profound about ritual, that its power lay partly in its repetition. These morning prayers were not meant to be dramatic or emotionally overwhelming. They were quiet, steady, reliable, like the dawn itself. The comfort came from their familiarity, from knowing that your father had performed these same rituals, and his father before him, stretching back through generations, an unbroken chain of devotion connecting you to your ancestors and to the gods. As the sky continued its gradual transformation from black to deep blue to the faintest hint of gray, communities across the ancient world would be stirring. In India, monks and holy men would be beginning their morning prayers, elaborate rituals that had been refined over centuries. The Vedic tradition placed enormous importance on the proper performance of morning rites, seeing them as essential not just for individual spiritual development, but for maintaining cosmic order itself. The prayers would be sung in Sanskrit, the ancient sacred language, verses that had been passed down orally for generations before ever being written. The sounds themselves were considered powerful, transformative, capable of affecting reality through their proper pronunciation and rhythm. A Brahmin priest would spend years learning these mantras, mastering not just the words, but the precise intonation, the breathing, the gestures that accompanied them. We can imagine the scene, a priest sitting cross-legged before a small fire, the flames just visible in the pre-dawn darkness, the wood carefully arranged, offerings placed nearby, everything positioned according to ancient prescriptions. The fire itself was sacred, a physical manifestation of Agni, the god of fire, who served as messenger between humans and the divine. Offerings placed in the fire, ghee and grains and fragrant woods, would be transformed into smoke, carrying prayers upward to the heavens. The breathing exercises that accompanied these prayers, pranayama, were themselves a form of prayer, inhaling, holding, exhaling in carefully measured patterns. The breath was understood as a connection to the universal breath, prana, the life force that animated all things. By controlling and directing the breath in these morning practices, the practitioner was aligning themselves with the cosmic rhythms, participating in the grand respiration of the universe itself. In China, the pre-dawn hours held special significance for practitioners of Taoist and Buddhist traditions. Monks in mountain monasteries would rise in darkness, the silence broken only by the sound of a bell or wooden clapper, signaling that the time for morning practice had arrived. They would gather in the meditation hall, moving quietly through the darkness, taking their places on cushions, settling into stillness. The practice of sitting meditation in these pre-dawn hours was considered especially powerful. The qi, the life energy that flowed through all things, was said to be at its peak just before dawn. The air was fresher, cleaner, the world not yet disturbed by the activities of the day. Sitting in darkness, waiting for the light, was itself a metaphor for the spiritual journey, the gradual awakening of consciousness, the emergence of clarity from confusion. We can picture these monks, perhaps in a temple high in the mountains, sitting perfectly still as the darkness slowly, almost imperceptibly, begins to lift. They are not waiting for something to happen, but rather being present with what is, moment by moment, breath by breath. The cold of the night still lingers. They can feel it in their bones, but they sit through it, accepting it, not resisting, not wishing for warmth, but simply experiencing what is. In indigenous communities around the world, from the Americas to Africa to Australia, morning prayers took forms intimately connected to the natural world. The sun was not an abstract concept or distant deity, but a living presence, a daily miracle, something to be greeted and thanked and honored. Shamans and spiritual leaders would often position themselves facing east, the direction of the rising sun, standing or sitting in readiness for that sacred moment when light would return to the world. Among some Native American traditions, the morning prayer might involve the burning of sage or sweetgrass, the smoke carrying prayers upward. The person praying might turn to the four directions, acknowledging each one, speaking words of gratitude, recognizing their place in the great web of creation. These prayers were not requests for personal gain, but rather acknowledgments of connection, statements of relationship, affirmations of the sacred nature of all things. The Maori of New Zealand had their own morning traditions, karaiki, prayers or chants performed at the beginning of the day. These might be done individually or collectively, but they served to frame the day within a spiritual context, to remind people that their actions had meaning beyond the merely practical. The karaiki would acknowledge the ancestors, the gods, the land itself, binding the community to its spiritual and physical home. Back in the Mediterranean world, as the eastern sky was definitely brightening now, the first hints of color appearing, sailors and fishermen would be preparing their vessels. But before pushing off from shore, before raising sail or taking up oars, prayers would be offered. The sea was understood as a realm of powerful gods, capricious, dangerous, not to be approached without proper respect. A simple prayer, a libation poured into the waves, might make the difference between safe return and disaster. Farmers, too, across the ancient world, would mark the dawn with prayers. Before taking up their tools, before heading to the fields, a moment would be spent acknowledging the forces that controlled their fate. Rain gods, sun gods, spirits of the soil, all needed to be honored. Agriculture was not just a technical activity, but a sacred partnership. Humans working with the land, guided and blessed by the divine, dependent on forces far beyond their control or understanding. In ancient Persia, followers of Zoroastrianism would face the east as dawn approached, offering prayers to Ahura Mazda, the god of light and wisdom. The religion placed enormous emphasis on the symbolism of light overcoming darkness, truth conquering falsehood. The daily return of the sun was not just a natural phenomenon, but a cosmic drama, a renewal of the eternal battle between good and evil, light and darkness. Morning prayers participated in this drama, aligning the worshiper with the forces of light. The fire temples of ancient Persia would maintain sacred flames that were never allowed to go out, but even these required special attention at dawn. Priests would tend the fires, adding fresh fuel, making sure the flames burned pure and bright. The fire was not worshipped itself, but rather understood as the symbol of the divine, pure, transformative, unchanging in its essential nature, while constantly moving and shifting in its forms. As the light continued to grow, minute by minute, the quality of darkness changing, thinning, becoming translucent rather than opaque, the various morning rituals across the ancient world would be approaching their culmination. This was the most sacred moment, when the sun would actually appear, when the first direct rays would strike the earth, when night definitively gave way to day. In Egyptian temples, the high priest would be ready, positioned precisely, waiting for that moment when sunlight would penetrate into the inner sanctum, illuminating the statue of the god. When it came, this shaft of light, cutting through the darkness, it was understood as the god's presence made manifest, the divine made visible. The priest would prostrate himself, offering prayers of gratitude and devotion, acknowledging this daily miracle, this gift of light and life. Greek and Roman worshippers, whether at temples or household shrines, would likewise mark this moment. The sun's appearance was often accompanied by a particular prayer or hymn, a formal acknowledgement that the day had truly begun. Some people would turn to face the rising sun directly, extending their arms, opening themselves to receive its light and warmth, feeling it on their faces, their hands, a tangible blessing, a physical connection to the divine. Buddhist monks, still sitting in meditation as the darkness lifted, would not leap up at the sunrise, but would simply continue their practice, allowing the growing light to gradually illuminate the meditation hall. The change from darkness to light was noted, acknowledged, but not made into a dramatic event. It was simply the natural unfolding of things, the way of the world, neither grasped at nor pushed away, just observed, accepted, integrated into the seamless flow of practice. The moment of actual sunrise, when the disk of the sun first became visible above the horizon, was often quite rapid. After the long, slow lightening of the pre-dawn, the sun itself seemed to leap into view, rising steadily, reclaiming the sky. But for those who had been awake through the darkness, who had prepared and prayed and waited, this moment was the culmination of a process, not a sudden event, but the fulfillment of something that had been building for hours. In the aftermath of these morning prayers, as full daylight arrived, people would transition into their daily activities. But they would carry with them, consciously or unconsciously, the frame that these rituals had created. The day had been begun properly, with awareness, with gratitude, with acknowledgement of powers greater than themselves. This grounding would influence everything that followed, providing a foundation of meaning and purpose to even the most mundane tasks. Children growing up in these various traditions would learn the morning prayers naturally, through observation and repetition. The small child might watch their mother at the household altar, not understanding the words but absorbing the attitude of reverence, the careful movements, the seriousness mixed with peace. Gradually, they would learn to participate, offering simple prayers of their own, growing into the tradition, making it their own, while connecting to the long line of ancestors who had done the same. The psychology of these morning rituals was profound. By beginning the day with prayer and contemplation before the rush of activity and responsibility, people created a space of calm, a reservoir of peace that could be drawn upon throughout the day. When challenges arose, when stress mounted, there was this memory of the quiet dawn, the moment of connection with the divine, the certainty that they were part of something larger than their immediate circumstances. The seasonal variations in dawn time meant that these morning rituals varied through the year. In summer, the pre-dawn awakening came very early indeed, when many people were still deeply asleep. Winter dawns were later, more manageable perhaps, but also colder, requiring more effort to leave warm beds and face the darkness. The committed practitioners maintained their routines year-round, but many ordinary people adjusted, being more faithful in some seasons than others, and this too was understood and accepted. Special occasions might call for more elaborate dawn ceremonies. Solstices and equinoxes, when the relationship between light and darkness shifted, were particularly significant. Temples might organize public dawn rituals, bringing communities together to mark these cosmic turning points. The shared experience of greeting the sun together, in groups large or small, created bonds of common purpose, reminding people that they were part of a community united not just by geography, but by shared beliefs and practices. We can imagine the various scents that would have accompanied these dawn prayers: the frankincense and myrrh in Egyptian temples, the smoke of sage in Native American ceremonies, the ghee and wood smoke of Vedic fires, the sweetgrass offerings of other traditions. These scents would have become powerfully associated with the spiritual practices, triggering memories and emotions, creating an olfactory dimension to the experience that deepened its impact. The sounds, too, would have been distinctive: the chanting of Sanskrit mantras, the rhythmic prayers in Greek or Latin, the bells and gongs that mark different parts of Buddhist and Hindu ceremonies, the simple spoken words at household altars. These sounds in the pre-dawn quiet would carry far, bouncing off stone walls and mountainsides, creating an atmosphere of sanctity, transforming ordinary spaces into sacred ones through the power of human voice raised in prayer. The physical sensations of these early morning practices also contributed to their spiritual impact. The cold stone floors under bare feet, the chill of pre-dawn air on skin, the warmth of fire or lamp, the smell of incense, the feel of water during ritual washing. These weren't distractions from spirituality, but rather integral parts of it, reminding practitioners that the sacred was not separate from the physical, but rather suffused through it, present in every sensation, every breath, every moment. As the full light of day arrived, as the sun rose higher and the world became fully illuminated, the intimate quiet of the pre-dawn hours would recede into memory, but its influence would remain, shaping the day that followed. People would move from these sacred spaces into the secular world, but carrying with them the peace and purpose they had cultivated in darkness, letting it inform their actions, guide their choices, remind them of what truly mattered. The merchants opening their shops, the farmers heading to their fields, the craftspeople taking up their tools, all would do so with the benediction of morning prayers resting on them. Their work was not separate from their spiritual life, but rather an extension of it. Another form of prayer, perhaps, a way of honoring the gods through diligent, skillful action in the world. In homes, parents would feed their children breakfast, prepare them for the day, send them off to their various activities. These mundane domestic tasks were also touched by the sacred beginning, made meaningful through connection to something larger. A mother who had prayed at dawn for her family's welfare now expressed that prayer through the care she took in preparing food, in checking that children were properly dressed, in offering words of encouragement and love. The elders of communities, having performed morning prayers for decades, would have developed a deep comfort with the practice. It would be as natural as breathing, as automatic as waking, yet still meaningful, still powerful. There is something beautiful about rituals that remain fresh even after countless repetitions, that continue to offer meaning and connection no matter how familiar they become. Priests and spiritual specialists, for whom morning prayers were not just personal practice but professional responsibility, would have felt the weight of this differently. They prayed not just for themselves, but on behalf of their communities, mediating between human and divine, maintaining the relationships that kept cosmic order intact. This was serious work, important work, requiring training and discipline and commitment, but also offering deep satisfaction, the knowledge that one's life was spent in service of the sacred. The architecture of temples and sacred spaces often reflected and supported these dawn rituals. Windows and doors positioned to catch the first light, orientations aligned with astronomical precision, spaces designed to create particular acoustic properties for prayers and chants. These buildings were not just containers for religious activity, but active participants in it, shaping the experience, creating conditions that facilitated connection with the divine. In mountain monasteries and remote hermitages, the morning prayers would have had an additional quality of solitude, of intimate communion with nature. The sounds of awakening birds, the rustling of wind in trees, the distant calls of animals, all became part of the prayer, reminders of the living world, the vast web of creation within which human spiritual practice took place. Hermits and solitary practitioners, living alone in desert caves or forest clearings, would greet the dawn with prayers known only to themselves and their gods. Without community to witness or structure to follow, their practice was entirely personal, entirely sincere. There was no one to impress, no form to maintain, just the pure relationship between individual and divine, stripped of all social convention and expectation. The continuity of these morning prayer traditions across centuries is remarkable. Despite changes in political power, despite the rise and fall of empires, despite wars and disasters and cultural transformations, people continued to wake before dawn to prepare themselves, to offer prayers, to greet the returning sun. This persistence suggests something essential about human nature, a need for ritual, for connection, for meaning that transcends particular historical circumstances. The skeptics and philosophers of ancient times, those who questioned religious conventions and traditional beliefs, often maintained morning practices even as they doubted the literal truth of the myths. There was value in the ritual itself, in the discipline of rising early, in the contemplative quiet of pre-dawn hours, in the way these practices structured time and consciousness, regardless of their theological underpinnings. As we think about these ancient morning prayers, from our perspective so far removed in time, there's a poignant quality to them. These were real people, just as alive and conscious as we are, facing the darkness, hoping for light, trying to make sense of their existence through ritual and prayer. Their specific beliefs may seem foreign to us, their gods unfamiliar, but the underlying human needs are instantly recognizable, universal, timeless. The gradual transition from darkness to light that they witnessed each morning is the same one we can still observe, unchanged by millennia. The sun rises the same way it always has, indifferent to human prayers and practices. Yet those prayers and practices gave meaning to the sunrise, transformed it from a physical phenomenon into a spiritual event, a daily renewal, a new beginning, a gift to be acknowledged and honored. In our modern world, with its artificial lights and 24-hour schedules, we have largely lost this intimate relationship with dawn. We can simulate sunrise with light boxes and alarm clocks, but it's not the same as actually waiting in darkness, watching the slow transformation, being present for the transition. Perhaps there is something to be learned from these ancient practices, not necessarily adopting their specific forms, but recovering their underlying wisdom, the value of beginning the day with awareness, with intention, with gratitude. The modern practice of morning meditation, secular or religious, echoes these ancient traditions. The principle is similar, creating a space at the beginning of the day for contemplation, for centering, for remembering what matters beyond the immediate demands of life. Those who maintain such practices often report similar benefits to what ancient practitioners must have experienced: a sense of calm, of purpose, of connection to something larger than themselves. The simple act of watching the sunrise, of being present for it, requires no elaborate ritual or specific beliefs. Just waking early, finding a place with a view to the east, and watching. Observing the gradual transformation of darkness into light. Feeling the stillness of pre-dawn hours. Acknowledging, in whatever way feels authentic, the gift of another day. This is something anyone can do, connecting directly to the same experience that ancient peoples to prayer. As the sun rises higher, as morning advances into day, the special quality of dawn fades. The world becomes busy, loud, filled with activity and distraction. But for those who have experienced the quiet of pre-dawn hours, who have watched darkness transform into light, there remains a memory, a knowing, an anchor point that the day can return to when needed. The ancient peoples understood something profound about beginnings. They knew that how you start matters, that the first moments set a tone that echoes through everything that follows. By beginning the day with prayer, with consciousness, with deliberate attention to the sacred, they were claiming agency over their experience, refusing to simply be swept along by circumstances, insisting that life would be lived with awareness and intention. In the grand scope of human history, these morning prayers represent just a tiny fragment, brief moments repeated countless times by countless people. Yet they mattered deeply to those who performed them, gave structure and meaning to their days, connected them to their gods and their ancestors and their communities. The prayers were whispered or sung or thought in languages mostly dead now, offered to gods mostly forgotten. But the essential human impulse they represented is still alive, still seeking expression, still searching for connection between the mundane and the sacred. We can imagine one final scene, a composite of all these various traditions, a hypothetical moment that captures something of their common essence. It is that moment just before the sun appears, when the light is clearly coming but has not yet arrived. A figure stands alone, or perhaps with others, in that special pre-dawn darkness. They have prepared themselves, washed, prayed, made offerings. Now they wait, poised between night and day, between sleep and waking, between the old day ending and the new day beginning. In this moment of suspension, of anticipation, there is a quality of pure potential. The day ahead is unwritten, full of possibility. The darkness is receding, not violently banished, but naturally, gently giving way to light. And in this figure, standing in readiness, in reverence, in hope, we can see all of humanity, all of us, forever poised at this threshold, forever greeting the dawn, forever grateful for the light's return, forever seeking meaning in the cycle of darkness and light that frames our existence. The sun will rise, as it always does, as it has done since long before humans walked the earth, as it will continue to do long after we're gone. But for now, in this moment, one person or many people are present for it, acknowledging it, honoring it, beginning their day with consciousness rather than unconsciousness, with gratitude rather than taking for granted, with awareness rather than mere routine. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is everything. The simple act of waking before dawn, of being present, of offering prayer or contemplation, of greeting the light. In this, humans across all ages and cultures have found something precious, something essential, something worth preserving and passing down through countless generations. Not because it changes the sun's rising, but because it changes us, transforms how we experience that rising, makes it sacred rather than ordinary, meaningful rather than automatic, a daily miracle rather than mere physics. The relationship between prayer and breath deserves deeper consideration. In so many traditions, the breath was understood as sacred, as literally the spirit moving in and out of the body. The Sanskrit word prana means both breath and life force. The Hebrew word ruach means wind, breath, spirit. When ancient peoples prayed at dawn, they were often very conscious of their breathing, using it to focus the mind, to calm the body, to create a bridge between the physical and spiritual realms. In yogic traditions, the pre-dawn hours were considered the best time for pranayama, breathing exercises. The air was believed to be purest then, cleanest, most charged with vital energy. A practitioner might sit facing east, performing alternating nostril breathing or other techniques, synchronizing breath with mantra or visualization, slowly building internal heat and energy, preparing body and mind for meditation or for the active day ahead. The simple rhythm of breathing in and out, when attended to consciously, has a naturally calming effect. Ancient peoples understood this instinctively, using breath as an anchor for attention during morning prayers. When the mind wandered, as minds always do, the breath provided a gentle way back, a constant, reliable presence, always available, always in the present moment. We can imagine a monk in ancient Tibet sitting in a meditation hall so cold that his breath forms clouds in the pre-dawn air. Each exhalation is visible. Each inhalation draws in air sharp enough to make the lungs ache. But this discomfort is not resisted. It's simply observed, part of the experience, part of the practice. The breath continues, steady, unchanging in its pattern, even as sensations shift and change around it. The act of prostration, bowing down, touching forehead to ground, was another common element in morning prayers across many cultures. This physical gesture of humility, of surrender, was not meant to be demeaning, but rather freeing. By acknowledging something greater than oneself, by literally lowering oneself, there was a release, a letting go of the ego's constant demands and defenses. In Buddhist practice, prostrations might be performed 108 times each morning, a moving meditation coordinated with breath and mantra. The number 108 had sacred significance, appearing in various spiritual calculations and cosmological systems. The repetition created a moving meditation, each prostration the same, yet slightly different, the body warming, the mind settling, thoughts gradually quieting. Islamic practice too involved prostration, the forehead touching the ground during the pre-dawn prayer called Fajr. This prayer was the first of 5 daily prayers, marking the end of the night and the beginning of the day. Muslims would perform ritual washing, wudu, cleaning hands and face and feet, then face toward Mecca, and through a series of prescribed movements and recitations acknowledged their submission to Allah. The call to prayer, the adhan, would sound from minarets across the Islamic world, a human voice cutting through the pre-dawn darkness, calling the faithful to wake and pray. The sound would carry far in the still air, reaching into homes and shops and caravanserai, a sonic reminder that the day was beginning, that it was time to turn thoughts toward the divine.
We can picture this scene in ancient Baghdad or Damascus or Cairo, the first call to prayer echoing across the rooftops, answered by similar calls from other mosques, creating a layered tapestry of sound, all proclaiming the same message, that prayer was better than sleep, that consciousness was better than unconsciousness, that the day should begin with awareness of the sacred. In Jewish tradition, the morning prayers, shacharit, would likewise be performed as early as possible, ideally timed so that the Shema, the central prayer affirming God's unity, would be recited just as the sun rose. Orthodox Jews would don tefillin, small boxes containing scripture verses, bound to arm and forehead with leather straps. The physical act of wrapping these ritual objects, feeling their weight, adjusting their position, became part of the prayer itself, engaging the body in spiritual practice. The prayer shawl, the tallit, would be wrapped around the shoulders, creating a private space within its folds, a tent of holiness within which to pray. The fringes, tzitzit, at the corners of the shawl served as reminders of the commandments, tactile prompts to consciousness and obligation. Everything in these morning rituals was designed to engage multiple senses, to create layers of meaning, to transform the simple act of speaking words into something richer, more dimensional. The content of these various morning prayers varied greatly across cultures, but certain themes recurred. Gratitude was nearly universal. Thanks for having survived the night, for being granted another day. Protection was another common theme, asking that the divine powers would watch over and guide through the hours ahead. Confession and purification also appeared frequently, the new day offering a chance to start fresh, to let go of yesterday's failings and begin again. In ancient Babylon and Assyria, the king himself would perform elaborate dawn rituals. His health and spiritual purity were understood as vital to the well-being of the entire kingdom. Court priests would assist him in washing, anointing, and putting on sacred garments. The prayers and offerings he made at dawn were on behalf of his people, a sacred duty of kingship, mediating between the human and divine realms, ensuring cosmic order was maintained. The sacrifices that accompanied many ancient prayers had their own significance. The offering of food, drink, incense, animals represented a giving back, an acknowledgement that everything humans possessed came ultimately from the gods. The sacrifice created a bond, a relationship of reciprocity, of mutual obligation and care. The smoke rising from morning offerings carried prayers upward, made them tangible, gave them substance. The element of fire in morning rituals appears across almost all ancient cultures. Whether the sacred fires of Vedic India, the burnt offerings of Hebrew tradition, the incense burners of Egypt and Greece and Rome, the eternal flames of Zoroastrian temples, fire held profound symbolic significance. It was transformative, changing whatever it touched, capable of both destruction and purification. It was also mysterious, alive in its way, moving, breathing, consuming, but also giving light and heat. We can imagine the hypnotic quality of watching flames in the pre-dawn darkness, the way they flicker and dance, casting moving shadows, creating an ever-changing play of light. This would have been deeply conducive to contemplation, the mind becoming absorbed in the movement, thoughts quieting, awareness expanding beyond the narrow confines of personal concern. The sounds of fire, too, would have been part of the morning prayer experience. The soft crackling of wood, the occasional pop and hiss, the whoosh as flames caught and spread. These sounds, in the profound quiet of pre-dawn hours, would have been clearly audible, even meditative in their randomness and unpredictability. No two fires sound exactly the same, yet all fires share certain qualities, creating a kind of natural music. Water played an equally important role in many morning rituals. The symbolic associations of water with cleansing, with life, with renewal made it perfect for dawn ceremonies. Rivers were especially sacred in many traditions, understood as bridges between worlds, as sources of both physical and spiritual sustenance. To bathe in a sacred river at dawn, or even to sprinkle oneself with its water, was to participate in its purifying power. In India, the Ganges River was and remains central to morning prayers for millions. We can imagine the ghats, the steps leading down to the water, crowded with people as dawn approaches. Some stand knee-deep in the flow, cupping water in their hands, offering it back to the river with prayers. Others immerse themselves completely, 3 times, a ritual purification before morning prayers. The river flows on, indifferent, but somehow also benevolent, accepting their devotion, carrying away their sins and sorrows. The stars fading in the lightning sky were closely observed by ancient peoples during their morning prayers. Certain stars had special significance, appearing at particular times, marking seasons and festivals. A priest might note which stars were still visible when the prayers began, which ones faded first as the sky brightened, using this natural clock to time the rituals precisely. The planet Venus, the morning star, had special importance in many cultures. Bright enough to remain visible even as the sky lightened, it was often personified as a god or goddess. The Maya tracked Venus with extraordinary precision, incorporating its movements into their calendar systems and religious ceremonies. To see Venus shining in the pre-dawn sky was auspicious, a sign of divine presence worthy of acknowledgement in morning prayers. Birdsong at dawn, that chorus that naturalists call the dawn chorus, would have been familiar companion to morning prayers. The birds sing most vigorously in those hours just before and after sunrise, males proclaiming territory, advertising their fitness to potential mates. But to ancient peoples, unaware of these biological explanations, the birdsong might have seemed like the birds' own prayers, their way of greeting the sun, acknowledging the new day. Some traditions incorporated this natural soundscape into their practices. Rather than seeing birdsong as a distraction, it was understood as part of the prayer itself, the whole natural world joining in worship. A monk meditating at dawn, hearing the birds begin their chorus, might smile inwardly, feeling connection, recognizing that humans were not alone in marking this transition, that all of creation participated in the miracle of dawn. The temperature change as dawn approached was another physical reality that shaped the experience of morning prayer. The coldest part of the night is typically just before dawn, when heat has been radiating away for hours and the sun's warmth has not yet returned. Practitioners would feel this cold, shivering perhaps, bodies seeking warmth yet continuing their prayers. The physical discomfort accepted as part of the practice. This physical challenge, this slight suffering, was not seen as pointless, but rather as valuable. It demonstrated commitment, sincerity, the willingness to prioritize the spiritual over mere physical comfort. A person who could rise in the cold darkness to pray was showing that their relationship with the divine mattered more than their personal ease, was declaring through action what they believed in theory. The different postures of prayer, standing, sitting, kneeling, prostrate, each had its own qualities and meanings. Standing suggested respect, readiness, alertness. Sitting implied settling in, commitment to longer practice, stability. Kneeling was humility, submission, acknowledgement of dependence on the divine. Lying prostrate was the ultimate surrender, the complete giving over of oneself, the body as flat and low as possible, offering no resistance. We can think about the physical effects of these postures, how they influenced breathing and circulation, how they affected consciousness and awareness. Modern research has shown that body position does influence mental state, that standing tall creates different emotions than hunching over, that the physical shapes we make with our bodies feed back into our psychology. Ancient peoples knew this intuitively, used posture deliberately to create and support particular spiritual states. The community dimension of morning prayers varied greatly. In some traditions, prayer was primarily an individual practice, done alone or with just one's immediate family. In others, gathering together was essential, the community collectively performing the rituals, their voices joining in shared recitation. Both approaches had value. Both created different kinds of experience and meaning. Praying alone allowed for deep personal communion, unmediated, intimate. Whatever arose could be brought directly to the divine without self-consciousness or concern for others' expectations. There was freedom in solitude, space for authentic emotion, for wrestling with genuine doubts and questions, for the raw honesty that's sometimes difficult in public. Praying in community created different gifts, the sense of not being alone, of being part of something larger, of one's voice joining with others to create something no individual could produce alone. The mutual encouragement, the shared commitment, the accountability that came from knowing others were depending on you to show up, to participate, to add your energy to the collective practice. In monastic communities, the morning prayers were carefully choreographed. Everyone knew their part, when to speak and when to be silent, when to sit and when to stand, when to bow and when to be still.
This precise coordination created beauty, a kind of spiritual dance. Many individuals moving as one body, their individual wills subordinated to the collective pattern, finding freedom, paradoxically, through acceptance of limitation. The role of the cantor, or prayer leader, was crucial in traditions where morning prayers were sung. A beautiful voice could lift the hearts of all who heard, could carry the prayers upward with special power. The training to become a cantor took years, learning not just the melodies, but when to speed up and slow down, when to sing softly and when to let the voice ring out, how to adapt to the acoustics of different spaces, how to lead without dominating, to invite participation rather than just perform. We can imagine the sound of ancient Hebrew prayers chanted in the temple in Jerusalem, or Greek hymns sung in the sanctuaries of Delphi and Olympia, or Sanskrit verses recited in the forest ashrams of India. These were not performances in our modern sense, not concerts where the audience passively listened. Rather, they were participatory events. Even those who couldn't sing the difficult parts could join in the responses, could add their voices to the amens and alleluias, could be part of the collective offering. The annual cycle of prayers, with special additions and variations for festivals and holy days, gave structure to time in ways we've largely lost. A priest or devotee wouldn't need to consult a calendar to know what time of year it was. The prayers themselves told them. When certain psalms were sung, when particular sacrifices were offered, when the rituals took one form rather than another, all of this marked the passage of time, connected the daily round to the great turning of the seasons. Preparation for special festival mornings might begin the night before, with extended vigils, purifications, elaborate preparations. The community would gather in darkness, maintaining watch through the night, so that when dawn came, it was greeted not by people just waking up, but by a congregation already assembled, already in an altered state, already open to the sacred through hours of prayer and ritual. The physical evidence of these ancient morning practices remains with us in various forms. Temple ruins oriented to catch the dawn light, their doorways and windows positioned with astronomical precision. Stone altars bearing traces of ancient offerings, soot stains showing where incense burned thousands of years ago, ritual vessels for water and oil and wine, ceramic lamps that once provided light in pre-dawn darkness. These archaeological remains are poignant, silent witnesses to practices long since abandoned. Yet they speak to the human need for ritual, for meaning, for connection to the divine. The specific beliefs may change, the gods may be different or gone, but the fundamental impulse, the drive to mark beginnings, to honor transitions, to find the sacred in daily life, this appears to be constant across cultures and ages. The prayers themselves, when they survive in written form, offer profound insights. The Vedic hymns, the Hebrew Psalms, the Greek Orphic hymns, the Egyptian pyramid texts. These are some of the oldest literature we possess, and so much of it is prayer, is words addressed to the divine, asking, praising, pleading, wondering. The human voice reaching across the void, hoping to be heard, seeking connection and meaning. Reading these ancient prayers today, even in translation, we can still feel their power, the universality of the concerns, the recognition that these ancient peoples faced the same fundamental questions we do, wondered about the same mysteries, sought comfort and understanding in similar ways. The specific cultural context may be foreign, but the underlying humanity is immediately recognizable, instantly moving. The longevity of some of these prayers is remarkable. Jewish morning prayers include blessings that have been recited in essentially the same form for more than 2,000 years. Muslims pray using verses from the Quran that have been unchanged for nearly 1,400 years.
Hindu mantras had been passed down orally for perhaps 3,000 years or more, maintained with such precision that scholars can trace linguistic changes through careful comparison of different recension. This continuity creates a powerful sense of connection to the past. When a modern practitioner recites these ancient prayers, they're using the same words their ancestors used, creating a living link across generations, participating in something larger than their individual life. The prayers become a kind of time machine, a way of touching the past, of joining one's voice to the countless voices that have spoken these words across millennia. Yet traditions also evolved and changed. New prayers were composed, old ones modified, practices adapted to new circumstances and understanding. This balance between continuity and change, between honoring tradition and allowing growth, characterized the living religious traditions. Those that became too rigid, too resistant to change, often withered. Those that changed too readily, losing their distinctive character, likewise faded. The successful traditions found a middle way, maintaining their essential identity while remaining responsive to new needs and insights. The translation of prayers across languages and cultures sometimes led to beautiful cross-fertilization. Buddhist practices moving from India to China to Japan, each culture adding its own elements while maintaining core principles. Christian monasticism adapting practices from Egyptian hermits, transforming them through contact with Greek philosophy and Roman organizational genius. Islamic mysticism, Sufism, drawing on Persian and Indian traditions while remaining firmly rooted in Quranic revelation. The morning prayers in particular seem to maintain special purity across these transmissions, perhaps because the dawn experience itself was so universal, so fundamentally human, that prayers designed for that liminal time needed little adaptation. The basic structure of waking, purifying, offering gratitude, asking blessing worked equally well in any cultural context, with any theological framework. Some individuals became famous for their morning prayers, their particular devotion or eloquence or spiritual insight expressed through these practices. Saints and mystics often emphasize the importance of morning practice, describing profound experiences that came through faithful attendance to these daily rituals. Their writings, when they survive, offer glimpses into the depths of meaning that could be found in what might seem like simple, repetitive activities. The letters and diaries of monks and nuns, when they mention their morning routines, often convey a sense of peace and stability, of finding their center through these daily practices. Even when life was difficult, when they struggled with doubt or faced hardship, the morning prayers provided an anchor, a reliable point of stability, a practice that could be maintained regardless of circumstances. This reliability, this constancy of the practice, even when feelings varied wildly, points to something important about ritual. It doesn't depend on emotion, doesn't require particular feelings or states. You can pray when you feel close to God or when God seems infinitely distant. You can pray when you're happy or sad, faithful or doubting, energized or exhausted. The practice holds steady through all these fluctuations, providing structure when everything else is chaos. For those going through difficult times, periods of loss or suffering or confusion, the morning prayers could be especially important. When nothing else made sense, when life seemed overwhelming, there was still the possibility of rising before dawn, of performing the familiar rituals, of speaking the ancient words. It might not make the pain go away, might not answer the unanswerable questions, but it provided a framework, a way to move through time, a structure that held when everything else was falling apart. The hermits and ascetics who devoted themselves entirely to prayer and contemplation understood morning practice as foundational to everything else. Some would spend the entire period from midnight to midday in prayer and meditation, the morning prayers being just one part of an extended spiritual practice. These extreme practitioners, through their commitment, blazed trails that others could follow more moderately, demonstrating what was possible, what depths could be plumbed through unwavering dedication. Yet even for these specialists, the sunrise itself retained special power. A monk might sit in prayer for hours in darkness, but when the first rays of sun penetrated his cell or hermitage, there would often be a shift, an intensification, a renewed sense of purpose and possibility. The physical reality of light returning, no matter how familiar, how expected, never entirely lost its wonder, its ability to move and inspire. This wonder at the sunrise, this capacity to find it meaningful and beautiful despite having witnessed it thousands of times, suggests something important about human consciousness. We can remain open to awe, can continue to find the familiar, mysterious, and worthy of contemplation. The sunrise never actually gets old, never truly becomes mundane if we approach it with proper attention and receptivity. The practice of morning prayer in this light can be understood as a training in attention, in presence, in the capacity to find meaning in the ordinary. By ritually marking the dawn, by bringing consciousness and intention to this daily occurrence, practitioners were cultivating a way of being in the world, a mode of awareness that could extend beyond the prayer time itself, coloring their entire experience of life. This transformation of consciousness was perhaps the deepest purpose of the prayers, more fundamental than any specific beliefs about gods or afterlives or cosmic order. The prayers were technology, spiritual technology, for shifting awareness, for opening perception, for creating states of consciousness that allowed different kinds of knowledge and experience to arise. The specific content of the prayers, the particular names invoked, the precise rituals performed, these were like the interface of the technology, the particular form it took in a given culture. But the underlying function, the actual operation, was similar across traditions, helping people access states of awareness beyond the everyday, beyond the small self, beyond the immediate concerns and anxieties that typically dominate consciousness. In this sense, the morning prayers were profoundly practical, not escapes from reality, but rather ways of engaging with reality more fully, more deeply, more truly. By temporarily stepping back from the ordinary concerns of daily life, by creating space for reflection and contemplation and connection, people were actually better equipped to handle those daily concerns when they returned to them, bringing perspective and peace that made challenges more manageable. The modern practice of mindfulness meditation, now secularized and widely taught, shares many features with these ancient morning prayers. The emphasis on breath awareness, on present moment focus, on accepting rather than resisting experience, all of these echo traditional contemplative practices. The forms have changed. The language has been adapted. But the fundamental activity, the basic human practice of training attention and cultivating awareness, remains remarkably similar. Perhaps this continuity suggests that we've rediscovered something important, that after a period of abandoning traditional practices, we're finding our way back to wisdom our ancestors possessed. The morning meditation practice that someone follows today, using an app on their phone, breathing and observing their thoughts, is connected, however distantly, to those ancient priests watching for dawn, to those hermits in their caves, to all those countless practitioners through history who recognized the value of beginning the day with conscious awareness. The different qualities of darkness in different seasons would have profoundly affected the experience of morning prayers. Winter darkness was thick, heavy, cold, requiring extra effort to leave warm beds and face the pre-dawn chill. The wait for light seemed longer, the darkness more resistant to the sun's eventual arrival. Summer darkness was lighter somehow, thinner, infused with warmth even before the sun appeared. Spring and fall held their own particular qualities. The air in spring fresh with promise, in autumn rich with the scent of harvest and decay. These seasonal variations meant that morning prayers had different emotional tones throughout the year. Winter prayers might emphasize endurance, fortitude, the hope that light and warmth would return. Summer prayers could be more celebratory, grateful, acknowledging abundance and ease. The prayers themselves might remain largely the same, but their resonance shifted with the seasons, taking on different meanings, speaking to different needs. The agricultural calendar deeply influenced morning prayer practices in farming communities. During planting season, prayers would focus on asking for good conditions, for gentle rains and warm sun,
for protection from pests and disease. At harvest time, gratitude would dominate. Thanks for the bounty, for successful crops, for the food that would sustain the community through winter. These weren't abstract theological concerns, but rather intimately practical, connected directly to survival, to whether the community would have enough to eat in the months ahead. We can imagine a farmer in ancient Mesopotamia standing in his field in the pre-dawn darkness, feeling the soil beneath his feet, smelling the rich earth, hearing the rustling of growing grain. His morning prayer would be shaped by these sensations, by his intimate knowledge of this land, by his direct dependence on the success of these crops. The connection between prayer and place, between ritual and the immediate physical environment, would be immediate, undeniable, profound. The role of ancestors in morning prayers varied across cultures, but was nearly universal in some form. Many traditions included prayers for the dead, offerings to sustain them in whatever afterlife was believed to exist. But there was also a sense of praying with the ancestors, of their presence being somehow accessible at dawn, of the barrier between living and dead being thinner in these liminal hours. In ancient Rome, the household prayers would include the manes, the spirits of family ancestors. Offerings would be made to them not out of fear, but out of love and respect, acknowledging that the current generation stood on the foundation built by those who came before. The ancestors weren't distant historical figures, but rather immediate presences, still concerned with family welfare, still offering protection and guidance. Chinese ancestor veneration similarly emphasized this continuing relationship. Morning prayers often included offerings at the family altar, incense burned before ancestor tablets, food placed for their sustenance. The living maintained relationships with the dead through these daily acts, keeping memory alive, ensuring that the bonds of family extended beyond the grave, across generations, creating a continuity that death couldn't sever. The indigenous peoples of Australia, with their concept of the dream time, understood morning prayers as connecting to the ancestral beings who shaped the land and established the laws. The dawn was a time when the boundary between the everyday world and the dream time became permeable, when the stories of creation could be accessed more easily, when the presence of the ancestors could be felt more strongly. We can picture an Aboriginal elder watching the sky lighten over land his people had inhabited for tens of thousands of years, singing the songs taught to him by his father and grandfather, songs that stretched back through countless generations, songs that described the very hills and rocks and waterholes he could see, songs that were simultaneously prayer and map and history and law. The morning prayer was not just words, but a reaffirmation of identity, of belonging, of unbroken connection to land and people and time immemorial. The prayers of enslaved peoples, forced from their homelands, held a particular poignancy. They prayed for freedom, for reunion with families, for a return to their lands and gods. Yet they also created new prayers, new forms of worship, adapting traditional practices to impossible circumstances, finding ways to maintain spiritual connection despite the violence and displacement imposed upon them. These morning prayers were acts of resistance, affirmations of humanity, refusals to let their spirits be crushed even when their bodies were in chains. In ancient Egypt, during the periods of foreign rule, when native practices were suppressed or discouraged, the morning prayers continued in secret, passed down carefully, maintained at great risk. The persistence of these practices, the refusal to abandon them even under threat, speaks to their profound importance, to how central they were to identity and meaning. To pray in the traditional way was to remain Egyptian, to maintain connection to ancestors and gods, to resist assimilation and erasure. The morning prayers of women deserve special consideration. In many ancient cultures, women's religious activities were separate from men's, conducted in different spaces, following different patterns. Women might gather together at dawn, sharing prayers, supporting each other, creating communities of spiritual practice that existed alongside but separate from male-dominated religious institutions. The prayers women offered often focused on their particular concerns: protection during childbirth, health for their children, harmony in the household. These were not lesser concerns, but rather the fundamental issues that shaped daily life, that determined whether families thrived or struggled, whether children lived or died. The morning prayers were where these concerns could be brought before the divine, where help could be sought, where burdens could be shared. We can imagine a circle of women meeting at a spring or well at dawn, drawing water together, praying together, their voices low, their movements practiced and familiar. These gatherings were social as well as spiritual, opportunities to talk, to share news and concerns, to support each other. The morning prayer time created space for female community, for relationships that sustained women through the challenges of daily life. In convents and female monasteries, the morning prayers followed the same rigorous schedules as male institutions. The nuns would rise in darkness, gather in the chapel, sing the office together. Their voices, trained through years of practice, would blend in harmonious prayer, creating something beautiful, something perfect in its way. The discipline of monastic life, the commitment to regular prayer regardless of how one felt, shaped consciousness, created stability, provided structure that many women found liberating rather than constraining. The physical space where morning prayers occurred also shaped the experience profoundly. A small chapel with low ceilings, intimate, cozy, created a different atmosphere than a vast cathedral with soaring vaults that made worshippers feel tiny. A home altar was different from either, personal, familiar, saturated with domestic associations. An outdoor site, on a mountaintop or by a river, brought nature directly into the practice. Wind and birdsong and the smell of earth becoming part of the prayer. Sacred groves and natural temples were common across ancient cultures. The Celts and Germans often worshipped in forest clearings, the trees themselves forming a natural cathedral, their branches arching overhead like vaulted ceilings. To pray at dawn in such a place, with morning mist still clinging to the ground, with the first rays of sunlight filtering through the leaves, created an experience of profound connection to the natural world, a sense that the earth itself was sacred, that the divine was present in tree and stone and stream. Desert peoples, whether in the Middle East or North Africa or the American Southwest, had their own sacred sites for morning prayer. Rocky outcrops with views to the horizon, where the sun's appearance could be witnessed unobstructed. Oases where palm trees provided shade and water gave life. These places accumulated sanctity through generations of use, the prayers of countless people seeming to linger in the air, making the space holy through repeated sacred attention. The sounds that accompanied morning prayers varied beautifully across traditions. The gentle shaking of a sistrum in Egyptian temples, its metallic rattling thought to please the gods. The blowing of the shofar, the ram's horn, in Jewish practice, its raw, primal sound cutting through the dawn quiet. The ringing of bells in Christian churches and Buddhist temples, their tones carrying far, marking time, calling the faithful. The beating of drums in African and indigenous American ceremonies, rhythm that moved the body, that created trance states, that connected human pulse to the heartbeat of the earth. Chanting and singing in morning prayers had profound effects on consciousness. The repetition of sounds, especially in languages not fully understood, could bypass the analytical mind, creating altered states, opening doors to different kinds of awareness. The vibration of sound in the body, feeling the words resonate in chest and throat and skull, made prayer a physical experience, not just intellectual or emotional, but also deeply sensory. We can imagine the overtone chanting of Tibetan monks, their impossibly deep voices creating complex harmonics, sounds that seem to come from somewhere other than human throats. or the elaborate melodic lines of Gregorian chant, voices weaving together in modal melodies that dated back centuries. Or the call and response of African religious songs, the community answering the prayer leader, their voices blending, creating collective energy that exceeded what any individual could produce. The silence between prayers, between chants or recitations, was also sacred. In many traditions, the words were punctuated by moments of complete quiet, pauses that allowed the prayers to sink in, that created space for listening rather than just speaking. These silences could be profound, pregnant with meaning, filled with presence even in the absence of sound. A Quaker meeting held at dawn might consist almost entirely of silence, the gathered community sitting together in darkness that gradually lightened, speaking only when moved by the Spirit, trusting that words would come when needed and that silence was equally valid, equally prayerful. This practice required deep comfort with quiet, with the absence of structure and script, with the willingness to simply be together in awareness, waiting, open. The transition from prayer to action, from sacred time to ordinary time, was handled differently across traditions. Some had formal closing rituals, prescribed ways of ending the morning prayers that marked the shift back to daily life. Others let the practice simply dissolve, the prayer time ending naturally as people turned to their day's tasks. But there was often a sense of carrying something forward, of letting the peace and focus of morning prayer infuse the hours ahead, of maintaining some thread of connection to the sacred, even while engaged in mundane activities. A Christian might make the sign of the cross, a final gesture as they left the chapel or finished their home prayers. A Muslim would conclude with specific phrases, turning head right and left to greet the angels believed to record human deeds. A Buddhist might dedicate the merit of their practice to all sentient beings, a reminder that individual spiritual development was not the ultimate goal, but rather a means of serving others. The simplicity of the most basic morning prayers, just a moment of acknowledgement, a word of thanks, is worth noting. Not everyone had time for elaborate rituals. Not everyone had access to temples or training in complex practices. But anyone could pause, could notice the dawn, could offer gratitude in their heart. This democratic accessibility, the way morning prayer could be as simple or complex as circumstances allowed, made it a practice that could genuinely belong to everyone, regardless of wealth or education or social position. A slave or servant rushing to begin their day's work might still have a moment to step outside, to look at the lightening sky and to whisper a prayer no one else would hear. A soldier on campaign, sleeping rough far from home, would wake to the same sunrise, might offer the same prayers his mother taught him as a child. A merchant beginning a journey, a student facing examinations, a sick person facing another day of pain, all could find a moment for morning prayer, for connection to something beyond their immediate circumstances. The resilience of morning prayer traditions through historical upheavals, through wars and conquests and cultural changes, speaks to their fundamental importance. When everything else was disrupted or destroyed, people often maintained their morning prayers, these being among the last practices to be abandoned, the most essential to preserve. In times of chaos and uncertainty, these daily rituals provided stability, reminded people of continuity with the past, gave structure to time when everything else seemed to be falling apart. The modern recovery of interest in morning practices, the proliferation of books and apps and classes on morning meditation and ritual suggests that we're recognizing what we've lost. In abandoning traditional morning prayers, in moving to a 24/7 lifestyle that ignores natural rhythms, we've disconnected from something important, something our ancestors understood. The return to morning practice, even in secular forms, represents a kind of homecoming, a rediscovery of ancient wisdom. As the full light of morning arrives, as this imagined scene fades, we are left with the echo of those ancient prayers, the memory of those countless dawns witnessed and honored. The specific words may be lost, the gods may no longer be worshipped, The temples may lie in ruins, but the impulse remains. The human need to mark beginnings, to honor transitions, to find the sacred in the everyday. That cannot be destroyed by time, cannot be eroded by changing beliefs. It is woven into the fabric of human consciousness, as permanent as the sunrise itself, as renewable as the dawn, as infinite as the cycle of darkness and light that will continue long after these words fade into silence and we drift gently into our own darkness, our own rest, our own waiting for whatever light comes next. Good night.